Florida, July 1969. The early morning calm is rocked by a massive explosion. The blast, as powerful as 200 tons of TNT, heralds the start of one of the greatest endeavors in history, the first mission to the moon.
Tower cleared.
We all think we know the tale of Apollo 11's triumphant success. But behind this legend lies a very different story. The untold account of how close the mission came to tragedy. Now, nearly 40 years later, men on that famous adventure reveal what really happened on the first voyage to the moon. We discover how the lunar module lost all contact with Earth and was almost out of fuel, heading for a boulder-filled crater. How astronauts believe they encountered a UFO in deep space, an event covered up until now. Classified documents show how President Nixon prepared an emergency speech when fears grew that the crew would get stranded. And we reveal how ultimately the crew only returned alive thanks to a ballpoint pen. This is the first-hand account by the men who were there. The untold story of Apollo 11's mission to the moon.
We have a liftoff, 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
It is July 16th, 4 hours before blastoff. Since early morning, Apollo 11's crew have been preparing for the most dangerous mission in history, the first lunar landing. In the crew room, astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins eat a final meal before making the last checks to their suits and equipment. But behind this facade of calm, tension was running high. Buzz Aldrin, the mission's lunar pilot, recalls the nerves the crew all felt.
I can't recall getting all that much sleep, knowing what was going to be happening the next day. There was enough adrenaline floating around in the crew quarters, I'm sure, for several missions to the moon.
The crew were right to feel nervous. What they didn't know was that on the launch pad, technicians were struggling with a dangerous fault on the giant Saturn V rocket. The Saturn V was the heaviest, most powerful rocket ever built. It was packed with 1 million gallons of highly explosive fuel, and it had sprung a leak.
120 feet below, technicians still working on a leaking valve that replenishes the hydrogen fuel supply for the Saturn V rocket.
Fuel leaks had plagued the Saturn V throughout its development. One stray spark on the launch pad could destroy the rocket and its crew. Gene Kranz, the flight director monitoring the countdown at Mission Control in Houston, was well aware of the risks.
A space mission will never be routine because you're putting 3 humans on top of an enormous amount of high explosive.
But solving dangerous problems against the clock was part of the deal for the space program. The rocket had to leave on schedule. For years, the Apollo team had been working exhausting hours to fulfill the dream of President John F. Kennedy.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Everything that we did was associated with the target of going to the moon before the decade was out.
Well, I was working 20-hour days for weeks, so it was a rather hectic and very busy time.
T-minus 2 hours, 33 minutes, 45 seconds and counting. This is Kennedy Launch Control.
With such little time left to solve the fuel leak, NASA decided to board the astronauts as the repair work continued down below.
At this time, the climb crew for Apollo 11 has boarded the high-speed elevator from inside the A level in the mobile launcher.
If there was a hydrogen leak somewhere during the time that we were inserted, maybe we were told about it, maybe not. Since they expect to solve the problem, why bother the crew about it?
All still going well with the countdown at this time.
With the minutes ticking away, technicians armed with special monkey wrenches seem to have fixed the hydrogen leak. NASA decided to give the go for launch. Apollo 11 would blast off on time.
The swing arm now coming back to its fully retracted position. T-minus 4 minutes, 50 seconds, and counting.
The crew were not concerned by the leaking hydrogen, as they believed that safety systems were in place for almost any eventuality.
We felt that our survival was in the probability of 99%.
4 minutes and counting. We are go for Apollo 11.
There were a lot of risks involved, but there were a lot of points to abort the mission short of continuing on something risky.
The crew had been told that should a leak cause an engine to fail on blastoff, their capsule would be ejected to safety far from the failing rocket. What the crew had been told was not the truth. Damning information in a memo publicly revealed here for the first time was circulated to a few select NASA officials a year before the mission. It revealed that this escape plan was mere fantasy.
There was a memo that came out about the first stage which indicated that contrary to all of the training that the crew were being given and the information they were told, we would not be able to save the lives of the crew if something went wrong during the first 2.5 minutes after liftoff. The abort system needed 2 seconds from the detection of a catastrophic failure to activate the launch escape system. The vehicle, if one engine had gone out on the first stage, within half a second, the vehicle would have begun to break up. There would have been no means of wrenching the crew to safety off the top of what would very soon have been an ascending fireball.
Totally unaware of this devastating fact, the astronauts prepared for launch.
30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good.
The explosive potential, if it exploded on the launch pad, would have wiped out a fair part of Florida.
20 seconds and counting.
I always say a prayer for the crew and for my mission control team that we'll be successful in the work that we are about to do.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal.
I said, I really want to try and remember this moment before all the excitement.
12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
As Apollo 11 left the pad, the astronauts were unwitting players in a massive gamble. At stake were their lives.
Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on proper heading.
The vast engines generated 220 million horsepower, more noise than 500 jumbo jets at takeoff. For the crew, however, the capsule was an oasis of calm.
Plus 30 seconds.
I think we agreed that we didn't hear and sense all the noise and vibration that was felt with the ignition of the engines.
Roll's complete and the pitch is programmed.
The exact moment of liftoff was very hard to determine, except the expected countdown, the words that we were hearing of liftoff, and the numbers beginning to change on the computer. Those were the big cues rather than any physical sensation.
We're through the region of maximum dynamic pressure now.
Yeah, everything looks good here.
2.5 minutes after blastoff, Apollo 11's massive first stage had powered the astronauts to a speed of 6,200 miles per hour and an altitude of 35 miles.
Downrange 35 miles, 30 miles high. Standing by for the outboard engine cut down now.
As the fuel ran out, explosive bolts jettisoned the spent stage, and the engines in Stage 2 fired up.
Stage and ignition.
The huge rocket, racing skywards with the astronauts on board, was being flown from the ground by Mission Control in Houston, Texas. But Mission Control was not as high-tech as it looked.
The console we sat at had lights on it, small indicator lights, that would mirror switch positions in the spacecraft, and we were monitoring what the crew did to the computer, and we could see what the computer saw. And actually, the computer screens that we looked at in our consoles in Mission Control weren't computer screens at all. They were televisions. All the letters or characters were all hand-drawn. I don't necessarily mean with a brush, but I mean they were printed on a slide.
All the screens were linked to Mission Control's mainframe computers. Despite filling a whole floor of the building, compared to modern computers of today, their total processing power was minute.
All the computers in Mission Control had more or less the power of one of today's laptops.
But running a whole space mission on the capacity of a single modern laptop was luxury compared to the computer power on board the spacecraft itself.
The computer in the spacecraft was maybe somewhere between a digital watch and a cell phone. I think a little closer to a digital watch. Very, very different. Extremely primitive.
Roger, 11. We'll pass that on, and it certainly looks like you're well on your way now.
As Mission Control plotted the rocket's progress 100 miles above the Earth, Apollo 11 was leaving the atmosphere and entering Earth orbit. The speed and fury of the 10-minute rocket journey was replaced by the serenity of space. The astronauts now maneuvered their command capsule to dock with the lunar module.
During its flight through the atmosphere on the Saturn V, the lunar module is kept in an air-protected shroud. The command and service modules are on the top of the stack, as we call it. The command and service modules separate and then turn around like so, come back in and dock with the lunar module.
Loud and clear now, Mike, and we understand that you are docked. That's affirmative.
And pull it out of the top of the third stage. And it's in that configuration that the two spacecraft fly to the moon.
The crew now jettisoned the final stage of the rocket to prepare for the 260,000-mile journey to the moon.
Apollo 11, over. Go ahead, 11.
As Apollo flew on, hundreds of communications ping-ponged between the spaceship and the ground. Failing to comprehend just one message could spell disaster. This placed everyone from the most junior team member to the flight director himself under immense stress.
It almost sounds like gibberish with all of this communication going on.
Still looking good.
Normally in Mission Control, I would listen to 5 to 7 communications simultaneously. My prime communications were in my flight director's loop. I had 2 air-to-ground communications loops. I had my loops from my own control team to their backroom team. With practice, you can pick out that communication which is essential to you doing your job.
But 3 days and 200,000 miles into the flight, Mission Control did miss the significance of a cryptic message from the astronauts.
Do you have any idea where the is with respect to us? Stand by.
The crew required information on the current position of the S-4B, the final stage of the rocket which had been jettisoned away 2 days earlier. This short message hid an extraordinary turn of events. Apollo 11 wasn't alone in space.
There was something out there that was close enough to be observed, and what could it be?
Traveling alongside Apollo 11 was a mysterious object, like this one filmed on a later mission. If the object wasn't part of Apollo's rocket, it could be only one thing: a UFO.
Mike decided he thought he could see it in the telescope, and he was able to do that. And when it was in one position, that it had a series of ellipses. But when you made it real sharp, it was sort of L-shaped. That didn't tell us very much.
NASA knew very little about the object reported by the Apollo 11 crew. It was obviously an unidentified flying object, but such objects were not uncommon, and the history of even Earth orbit space flights going back over the previous years indicated that several crews saw objects.
Despite having a clear view of the UFO, the crew were wary of reporting it to mission control.
Now, obviously, the three of us were not going to blurt out, "Hey, Houston, we got something moving alongside of us, and we don't know what it is. You know, can you tell us what it is?" We weren't about to do that, because we know that those transmissions would be heard by all sorts of people, and who knows what somebody would have demanded that we turn back because of aliens or whatever the reason is. So we didn't do that, but we did decide we'd just cautiously ask Houston, how far away was the S4B?
Unaware of the drama unfolding in space, Mission Control radioed the position back to Apollo 11.
Apollo 11, Houston, the S4B is about 6,000 nautical miles from you now, over.
And a few moments later, they came back and said something like it was 6,000 miles away because of the maneuver. So we really didn't think we were looking at something that far away. So we decided that after a while of watching it, it was time to go to sleep and not to talk about it anymore until we came back in debriefing.
To this day, whatever it was the crew saw has never been positively identified or officially acknowledged.
The possibility that you might encounter aliens in space has to be considered in a very sensible and positive and realistic way. There were a lot of people within the program who went off later and became convinced that UFOs existed. And that led to some concern on NASA's part, where they got the agreement of the crew never to publicly talk about these things for fear of ridicule.
After this close encounter, the crew hoped for a good night's sleep, but they were in for a surprise. Another strange event would disturb them, not outside in the vastness of space, but right inside the spacecraft itself.
I remembered as I began to make an attempt to go to sleep, and all of a sudden I would see a flash somewhere, and before I could turn or get my eye on the flash, it was gone. Now, the first impression was, well, something just penetrated the inside of the spacecraft. And so I asked Neil and Mike, and Neil said, yeah, I saw about 100 of them.
For the crew, the flashes were far more worrying than the mystery UFO. In the vacuum of space, anything penetrating the spacecraft could spell disaster. On his return, Aldrin reported them to NASA.
The conclusion was that they're high Z particles, Z meaning a heavy particle at high velocity, that penetrate the spacecraft, penetrate the individual, and cause some potential damage to nerve cells and brain cells, but only over a long period of time, evidently.
Even today, scientists don't truly understand the long-term effects of Z particles on the human body. Apollo 11 flew on, constantly bombarded by particles. But worse was to come. Now, as the craft reached lunar orbit 260,000 miles from home, the astronauts prepared for what would be the most dangerous and unpredictable part of the mission, the descent to the moon itself.
The controllers are normally a very chatty group. They always got some kind of a wisecrack, some kind of a joke. On this day, there was a degree of seriousness that I hadn't seen before, or hadn't seen in training. You finally realize this is real. This is the whole enchilada. We're going for broke. Today, we land in the moon.
As Apollo 11 orbited 80 miles above the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin entered the lunar module before undocking, leaving Collins behind in the command ship. The strangest spaceship ever to fly, the lunar module, codenamed Eagle, was known around the globe as a miracle of engineering. Mission Control knew, however, that behind the space-age design lay some drastic weaknesses.
The lunar module, I think, totally loaded, weighed a little over 33,000 pounds. The skin on the crew cabin was very thin, and that was all done because of weight savings. Weight was a very critical item that always had to be considered in anything that you did.
If you really took your finger and poked hard at it, you could poke right through the outer skin of the spacecraft. It was about the thickness of 2 layers of aluminum foil. But it's the kind of thing that you were reasonably cautious that you didn't jab any pointed objects through.
But the fragile skin of the craft was not the only danger. Behind the scenes, the development of the module had been fraught with serious accidents and breakdowns. One such failure had almost cost Neil Armstrong his life. In training for the flight, Armstrong had practiced on 2 bizarre prototypes that mimicked the gravity conditions of the moon.
In order to train the crews, we used 2 vehicles, the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle and the Lunar Research Vehicle. And one was suspended on wires and was very safe and didn't have actual engines. And then there was the hairy, scary Lunar Landing Training Vehicle.
Buzz Aldrin already had his doubts about the lunar trainer.
I could see that this was a vehicle that you had to really pay very close attention to. If you had not completely shut off the descent thrust, you could run out of attitude fuel much sooner than you might expect.
The motor that was simulating the lunar module engine was the one that Neil Armstrong would throttle in order to rehearse going down to the surface of the moon. And, as all human machines tend to, they fail occasionally.
Despite the disaster, NASA chiefs were impressed with Armstrong's quick reactions.
Neil Armstrong really got an assured ticket to a flight on Apollo 11 because of his success in saving his own life and ejecting when he came within a fraction of a second of death.
With no second chances in space, Armstrong and Aldrin would now have to pilot the real lunar module faultlessly on its designated flight path around the dark side of the moon before the final landing attempt. Immediately, things started to go wrong.
As soon as the spacecraft came around from behind the moon, we got tracking data that indicated it was not on the proper trajectory. My guidance officer, Steve Bales, calls out flight. I've about halfway to my abort limit here. We seem to be out in our radial velocity. As soon as he said the words halfway to our abort limit, our communications were all broken. We couldn't communicate with the lunar module.
Without communications or computer data, Mission Control couldn't monitor the module's systems or control its descent. Desperately, they tried another way. They rerouted communications to the lunar module via Mike Collins in the orbiting command ship. This patched-up link restored a weak signal between the crew and the ground, but it wasn't to last.
It was up to me to decide if we had enough information to make the go-no-go and continue the descent to the moon. 5 minutes prior to powered descent, I had my controllers go through a go-no-go, and immediately we lost data again. So I added the words, "Give me your go-no-go based on the last valid frame of data that you saw."
Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro, go. Fido, go. Guidance, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Econ, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for landing.
As communications cut in and out, the lunar module began to power its way down to the surface.
Get that Capcom, you're a go. You go to continue power descent. You're a go to continue power descent.
It was sort of like a controlled fall out of orbit. It's almost like a car on a very long mountain road with the driver riding the brake to adjust the speed and keep from going too fast.
To avoid colliding with the moon, the lunar module now switched on its landing radar to determine its precise altitude.
Okay, we got data back. Radar flight looks good. Right.
The landing radar could begin to feed in the difference between its position and velocity and what the computer thought the position and velocity was. And that number, as it began to correct, would go smaller and smaller.
Roger. 2,000 feet. Roger.
But switching on the landing radar started a catastrophic chain of events that would turn the landing from a drama into a full-blown crisis.
1202, stand by. 1202. 1202, 1202, 1202, what's that?
Overwhelmed by information from the landing radar, the tiny onboard computer crashed. Instead of giving the crew vital information, it was flashing up a major overload warning.
The first alarm that we got was an executive overflow alarm, which means that there's too much information coming in.
That's not one of those alarms we like, because it's not supposed to happen in flight.
And there's a lot of information going into that very, very tiny computer. And all of a sudden it says, "I'm sorry, I can make no sense of this. I'm stopping, I'm shutting down."
On board the lunar module, the astronauts were stunned.
Whatever information we were looking at, whether it was velocity and then movement over the ground, we didn't see those anymore. Instead, it gave us a code, the number of the alarm. It was disturbing, it was distracting. We were looking at it, wondering what it meant.
Perhaps even more disturbingly, no one at Mission Control had any idea what the alarm meant either. In desperation, they turned to 24-year-old backroom computer whiz kid Jack Garman for advice as to whether the mission could continue.
When that alarm occurred, I was probably the only one in the control center that knew what it was. I had no question about it.
By sheer good fortune, Garman had come across this alarm in a training exercise and had scribbled down the correct course of action on a scrap of paper.
My response was within 5 or 6 seconds saying, yeah, that one's okay, as long as it doesn't reoccur.
1202 alarm. It's executive overflow. If it does not occur again, we're fine.
Garman advised that if the alarm was a one-off, the mission could continue. But the problem wasn't about to go away. The landing radar continued to overload the computer.
After we got an advice from essentially the back trenches to say, no, keep going, we'd no sooner got used to that when we got another failure, again, which is more of the same, only on a bigger scale.
We have another 1202 alarm. Same alarm, and it appears to come up when we have a 1668. Leave it alone and we'll monitor it, okay?
Now, of course, when it happened again, I was a little nervous. We all were. Is it going to start happening real often? And it's going to lose control of itself. It won't be able to command the vehicle. That was a little nerve-wracking.
With the computer plunging the module into chaos, Armstrong decided to override it and take manual control of the vehicle. But by now, the spaceship had veered a long way off course.
We now recognize, and we're still about 5 or 7 minutes above the lunar surface, through tracking that the crew is doing, they recognize they're not over the landmarks they should have been, and they're going to have to guide the spacecraft to a landing.
Neil was paying attention, really, more than I was. He was looking out the window. We had craters drifting by. There weren't very many identifiable craters, and Neil said, I think we may be a little long.
The module was lost, but that wasn't all. The descent engine's fuel tank was running critically low.
Now the really dicey part of this mission will continue, because we would normally in training have landed by about 10 minutes. We now get to the point where I get a call from my controller that we have now had low level.
Low level?
And we know by experience and by design that we will have 2 minutes of fuel remaining at an average throttle setting of 30%.
With the module still at 500 feet, it was rushing into unknown terrain. The odds did not look good.
We'd never been this close in training. We start a clock running, a stopwatch, in the back room with the controller, and he is now calling off seconds of fuel remaining. My spacecraft communicator says, "Flight, we better get pretty quiet now."
Okay, the only call-outs from now on will be fuel.
At that point, things really started to get pretty tense because, Armstrong knew that the fuel supply was dwindling. He had to find a safe spot to land, and he looked out the window and saw this crater the size of a football field with these boulders the size of small cars all around it, and that's where the computer was taking them.
With the fuel running out, the astronauts were faced with a dilemma.
100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward.
The easiest thing to do is to just slow the rate of descent and fly over whatever it is. That takes longer, burns more fuel, and makes fuel quantity at touchdown a little less.
We get a call that we've had 60 seconds. We pass this up to the crew.
Guys looking good, down and half. 60. Gotcha. 6 forward. 60. 60 seconds. 60 seconds.
I seem to recall we were a little over 100 feet. And without trying to disturb Neil's concentration, I was giving him a little body English to get on the ground as soon as you can.
I have a look at the descent rate and say, boy, we're really going to have to drop this guy down towards the surface. And there, it's going to be close.
And 4 forward. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds. 30 seconds forward.
We always said in the simulators, if they got to 30 seconds, forget it, scrub and abort. But in that little window, Neil Armstrong could see the lunar surface coming up, and he knew that if he kept going, he would put it down.
I could see the shadow getting bigger and bigger because the sun was behind us, and we were getting closer and closer to the shadow of the lander, and the dust began kicking up.
Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Contact light. Okay, engine stop, seeing event.
Apollo 11 had landed, with barely 15 seconds of fuel to spare.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Thank you. You're looking
The
good.
team completed the post-landing checks. Only then could they reflect on what a very close call it had been.
Things are kind of in slow motion. You are in somewhat control of what you're doing. But afterwards, you may faint because you realize how close it was.
I personally felt physically sick, and I was shaking. Because after years of work, you don't think of how you're going to prepare yourself for the moment.
Originally, It was determined the crew would go to sleep as soon as they got in the moon, but I mean, the adrenaline must really be pumping. Nobody's going to go to sleep.
Immediately, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong got into their bulky spacesuits. They prepared to make history. The world waited and waited for Armstrong to appear, but no one emerged from the module. Unbeknown to everyone, the astronauts' moment of triumph was being held up. They couldn't open the hatch.
It was lack of realization how low the pressure really had to be inside, and usually when you open a valve, why, it doesn't really get anything out right away. So we tried to pull the hatch open down underneath the instrument panel, and it wouldn't come open.
Neil, this is Houston. What's your status on hatch opening? Houston, what's it? Push outward. Get some light. It's unlocked, yep. Unlocked. They hate to tug on that thing.
Aldrin eventually bent back the flimsy door to equalize the pressure. With the hatch open, the moon was within their grasp.
The hatch is coming open.
Now, as Neil Armstrong finally prepared to set foot on the moon, the whole world anxiously waited for his first words.
I'm at the foot of the ladder.
Poor guy. My heart goes out to anybody in that position. You know, people gave him all kinds of suggestions. I think there were passages from Shakespeare and quotes from the Bible and, you know, lines and lines of poetry. In the end, what it came down to was after they had landed, he had a chance to think about it. Okay, we're here. What am I going to say?
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And I think it's a beautiful quote.
It's very symbolic and very, very well done.
Those words were great. They represent the first movement of mankind off our planet.
Okay, ready for me to come out? All set.
After 15 minutes, Aldrin left the module to join Armstrong on the surface, making sure not to make a simple but fatal error.
Since I was the last one out, I'm gonna reach back and partially close the hatch, making sure not to lock it on my way out. If it had sprung a leak somehow and it closed that hatch, it would have been very difficult to have ever opened it again from the outside.
Both hands down about the fourth rung up. There you go.
Now, for the first time, astronauts could experience the reality of being on the moon.
Standing under lunar gravity with the very soft, maybe inch or so of lunar dust, there's not much of a feeling that's translated at all from stepping on different portions of the surface. It's quite smooth, and it's easy to push off with your feet and just put a foot out there. You can look out at the horizon and see very clearly, because of no atmosphere, haze, or anything. You can see objects very, very clearly.
Beautiful view. Isn't that something?
The best way to describe what we were looking at was just utter desolation with no signs of life whatsoever.
Biggest thing about the moonwalk scientifically was get a sample of the moon. There were 2 rock boxes made out of aluminum. They were supposed to be filled with samples of dust and rock and brought back to Earth, and see what that might tell us about the history of the moon. Aside from that, there was a seismometer to detect moonquakes and see if the moon had any geologic activity.
But while Armstrong painstakingly performed these scientific tasks, to millions of viewers, Aldrin appeared to be skipping aimlessly around the moon. The truth behind this bizarre behavior can now be revealed.
Buzz decided to experiment with locomotion on the moon. And this was actually something that he had planned, that was a specified objective before the flight.
They had plenty of footage of us walking slowly, but then I wanted to try and move in sort of a kangaroo hop, making a turn that's sort of like the lead that a horse has in turning with his front feet is sort of a 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, and that does give you naturally the best control on the surface of the moon.
As Aldrin galloped around, he was interrupted by the longest distance phone call in history. It came from President Nixon in the White House.
Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made.
President Nixon, we expected he would make a call to the astronauts because this was a major international photo op. And politicians need to take advantage of every such opportunity.
For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives.
Nixon had been quick to cash in on the massive global interest in the moon landing. But behind the scenes, he was concerned. What were the chances of the crew ever leaving the moon alive? Of all the dangers, the next stage of their mission was the most risky of all. Again, the lunar module was at the heart of the problem.
The serious concerns in the design of the lunar module was that you only had one engine that had to fire to get off the surface of the moon.
In earlier test flights, the engine had given grave cause for concern.
The ascent engine failed on the 6 times it was tested in space, on at least 3 of those occasions to some degree or other. So there was a 50-50 chance that that engine would work exactly as planned.
If for some reason the ascent engine didn't work, there was no way to rescue the crew, and basically the crew is lost.
Nixon became so concerned about the astronauts becoming stranded that his aides prepared a memorial speech to be broadcast worldwide. This classified document remained buried in government archives for over 30 years.
Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery. But they also know that there
Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, however, would never have given up hope.
Rather than worry about things like that, we'd face them when the time came. Well, we'd work as hard as we could to fix the problem until the oxygen ran out and we just fell asleep.
Adios, amigo. Hey. Negative. Head on up the ladder, Buzz.
With possible engine failure weighing on their minds, the astronauts returned to the module from their 2-hour moonwalk, only to make a shocking discovery.
In looking around at some of the lunar dust on the floor, I discovered something that really didn't belong there, the broken end of a circuit breaker.
In the cramped conditions of the module, their bulky spacesuits had snapped off the very circuit breaker essential for starting up the engine.
Houston, Tranquility, do you have a way of showing the configuration of the engine arm circuit breaker? Because the end of it appears to be broken off.
Now, I could see in there that there was the broken part still on the inside, so in order to arm that switch that would turn on the engine to lift off to get us back home, that had to be pushed in. We felt lonely, only 2 guys. We knew that more people were paying attention to us than probably had paid attention to 2 people before in the world, and we were further away than 2 people had ever been.
Mission Control were powerless to help.
if the engine could not be started by some workaround means, there would be no rescue available.
It was up to the astronauts to improvise a solution using only items they had with them on board. To this day, Aldrin treasures the everyday object that saved their lives.
These are my memorabilia that represents our solution to a somewhat critical problem. In the countdown procedure, I used a pen, one of several that we had on board that didn't have metal on the end, and we used that to push the circuit breaker in.
Okay, master arm on.
Aldrin jammed his pen into the circuitry, and with Armstrong at the controls, Apollo 11 engaged the engine and hoped for the best.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, port stage, engine arm ascent, proceed. Beautiful. 26, 36 feet per second up. 5 to the pitch over.
Aldrin's ingenuity had saved the pair from a lonely death. It remained for the crew to rendezvous with a command ship orbiting far above the surface.
Okay, Mike. I'll try to get in position here, and then you got it.
Only when this maneuver was accomplished could the crew begin to believe that Apollo 11 might bring them and their precious cargo of moon rock safely home.
Once we left lunar orbit, that gave us, for almost the first time, a relaxed sensation of we're heading home, we're looking to come back, and then have our own slightly late celebrations.
But they weren't home and dry yet. 8 days after the start of their mission, Apollo neared the Earth to prepare for the last great danger, re-entry. If the module approached the atmosphere from the wrong angle, it could burn up or simply bounce off into space.
If you come in too steep, you're going to have very high G-forces, high temperature. If you come in too shallow, you won't slow down below orbital velocity before you start gaining altitude and going back out again. And of course, under those conditions, you may not have enough oxygen to survive coming back in again.
See you later.
There's blackout.
The intense heat of re-entry caused a total communication blackout with the module. For 4 anxious minutes, no one on the ground would know if the tiny craft had survived the high temperatures. Off the coast of Hawaii, Nixon, aboard the carrier USS Hornet, awaited his next photo call.
At blackout, we were showing velocity 36,237 feet per second. Range to go to splash 1,510 nautical miles.
We were excited, all right. We were just wondering, would the parachutes open?
Apollo 11, this is Hornet, over. Apollo 11, reading the loud and clear.
At 15,000 feet, the 3 parachutes deployed. Against all the odds, Apollo 11 was coming home.
And somewhere, I guess, below 10,000 feet, we could smell salt air. And that was quite a welcome home sensation.
In the back of my mind, I could almost hear President Kennedy's words. We choose to go to the moon.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Now, all the close calls, equipment malfunctions, and human errors that nearly cost the crew their lives were forgotten. The first lunar landing was a success. NASA believed itself to be invincible.
The feeling was definitely there that, man, just throw any challenge at us and we can meet it. We can do anything. You want us to go to Mars? We'll do that. You want us to build a space station? We'll do that. You want us to build a reusable space shuttle? Sure, we'll do that too.
But over 30 years later, And with the reality of losing shuttle missions in space, the men on the Apollo team now realize just how lucky they had been.
If we were to approach somebody today with the idea of flying to the moon like we had in 1969, they would laugh in our face and say, there's no way that you're going to be able to do that. It's not safe enough.
Spaceflight is intensely risky. High risk was needed to get that mission done. I think most of the flight crews would agree that had we not stopped flying Apollo missions when we did, we would definitely have lost lives on those missions.
But despite the perils of blastoff, encounters with a UFO, low fuel, computer failures, and the need to save the mission with a ballpoint pen, there is still one man for whom failure was not an option.
I don't look back and pat myself on the back for being part of a real risky maneuver. I think we made some bold decisions. Yeah, we had things that could have gone wrong, and some did go wrong, but we also had an inspired group of people pioneering, and I marvel at the very close conditions that resulted in my still being alive to go to the moon and to be here today.
It is only now that we can truly understand just how close to disaster Apollo 11 really came.
Tomorrow, take to the air with the dedicated men and women who are everyday heroes saving lives in danger in the premiere of Chopper Rescue, tomorrow night at 8. But stay with us now for Late Line.